Sometimes, the choices that define us happen in a single moment when nobody's watching. For Clayton Reese, that moment came on a frozen Montana trail when he found a dying stranger in the snow. Clayton was one of the wealthiest cattlemen in the territory, heading home from business when he spotted the half-frozen man. Most folks would have kept riding, but Clayton stopped. He carried the stranger back to his lodge and nursed him through fever and delirium. The man mumbled strange things about buried secrets and forgotten names. As days passed, Clayton began piecing together the stranger's ramblings. What he discovered changed everything he believed about his past. This dying man wasn't a stranger at all. He was Clayton's brother, presumed dead for 30 years. But how could this be possible? And what really happened that terrible night so long ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the pine trees surrounding Clayton Reese's mountain lodge like the voices of long-dead ghosts, a sound he'd grown accustomed to over the decades of solitary living. At 62, Clayton had built an empire from nothing, owning more cattle and land than any man had a right to claim in these parts of Montana. His spread stretched across 3 valleys, encompassing nearly 50,000 acres of prime grazing land, timber rights, and mineral claims that had made him wealthy beyond most men's dreams. The lodge itself stood as a testament to his success, a massive structure of hand-hewn logs and native stone that commanded a view of the entire Bitterroot Range. Inside, the great room soared 20 feet to exposed beam ceilings, dominated by a fieldstone fireplace large enough to roast a whole steer. Expensive leather furniture arranged around Persian rugs spoke of a man who'd learned to appreciate the finer things, though he'd earned every penny through sweat, determination, and more than a few hard choices along the way. Clayton pulled his grandfather's pocket watch from his vest, the gold timepiece catching the firelight as he checked the hour. The watch bore the Reese family name engraved in flowing script across its face, a reminder of the legacy he carried and the weight of expectations that had driven him since boyhood. 10:30 in the evening, and the stranger still hadn't stirred from the guest bedroom upstairs, where Clayton had been tending to him for the past 3 days. The man had been more dead than alive when Clayton found him collapsed in the snow along the high trail that led to his property. No horse, no supplies, wearing clothes that had seen better decades. Most troubling of all, no identification of any kind. In these mountains, a man traveling without proper gear in winter was either desperate, foolish, or running from something. Clayton suspected all 3 might apply to his unexpected guest. He'd been returning from Missoula after settling a boundary dispute with a neighboring rancher, a disagreement that had cost the other man considerably more than anticipated when Clayton's lawyers finished with him. The Reese name carried weight in Montana territory, and Clayton had learned long ago that reputation and resources were often more valuable than bullets when it came to getting what you wanted. He'd built his fortune on being smarter, more ruthless, and better prepared than his competition. The ride home should have been routine, just another day's business for one of the most successful men in the territory. But something about the way the snow had been disturbed along the trail caught his attention. Years of reading sign in these mountains had taught him to notice what didn't belong, and the irregular pattern in the snow suggested someone had fallen or been dropped there recently. Clayton's breath had formed clouds in the bitter cold as he dismounted and approached the motionless form. The man was dressed in a worn leather coat that had once been fine quality, his dark hair streaked with silver and his face weathered by decades of hard living. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his lips blue with cold. Another hour in that snow and he would have been beyond help. Most men would have checked for signs of life, and finding them weak, would have ridden on to fetch help from town. But something about the stranger's face nagged at Clayton, a familiarity he couldn't quite place. Instead of leaving, he'd wrapped the man in his spare blanket, hoisted him across his saddle, and brought him home to the lodge. For 3 days now, Clayton had been playing nursemaid, something he hadn't done for another human being since Samuel. The thought of his younger brother still brought a familiar ache to his chest, even after all these years. Samuel Reese had been dead for 30 years. Killed in a shootout over stolen gold down in Bannack, or so the newspapers had reported. Clayton had been building his first herd then, working 16-hour days to establish the foundation of what would become his empire. The news of Samuel's death had reached him through a telegram delivered by a trembling messenger who'd ridden hard from town. The boy had found Clayton breaking horses in the north pasture, and the look on the kid's face had told him the news was bad before he'd even read the words. Samuel Reese, aged 25, shot dead while attempting to rob the Bannack Bank in company with known criminals, a crime that had shocked everyone who knew the family. Their father, Sheriff William Reese, had died of what the doctor called a broken heart just 6 months later. The shame of having a son turn outlaw had been more than the old man could bear. Clayton had been left alone, the sole heir to a tarnished family name and a modest ranch that he'd spent the next 3 decades transforming into something worthy of respect. He'd thrown himself into work with the desperate energy of a man trying to outrun his ghosts. Every successful cattle drive, every land acquisition, every business deal that added to his wealth was another step away from the poverty and shame that had defined his youth. The Reese name would be respected again, he'd sworn, even if it killed him. The stranger upstairs stirred occasionally, muttering words that Clayton couldn't quite make out. Fevered ramblings about buried secrets, about names lost to time, about people who were still looking. Clayton had learned not to put too much stock in the words of delirious men, but something about the stranger's voice troubled him in ways he couldn't explain. He'd sent word to Doc Harrison in town that he was tending to an injured traveler, but had requested the doctor wait a few days before making the journey to the lodge. Clayton told himself it was because the roads were dangerous after the recent storm, but the truth was, he felt oddly protective of the mysterious man. There would be questions when people learned about the stranger, and Clayton wasn't ready to provide answers he didn't have. The lodge felt different with another person in it, even an unconscious one. For years, Clayton's only regular company had been his foreman, Jake Morrison, and the seasonal hands who worked the cattle. He'd grown comfortable with solitude, preferring the straightforward honesty of animals and the mountains to the complications that came with most human relationships. But now, listening to the stranger's labored breathing from the room above, he found himself remembering what it felt like to worry about someone other than himself. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and sending snow devils swirling across the yard. The storm that had deposited the stranger on his trail had blown through, but winter in the high country was far from over. Anyone traveling these mountains in such conditions was either very brave or very desperate. Clayton was beginning to suspect his guest was both. He walked to the window and gazed out at the moonlit expanse of his domain. Thousands of cattle dotted the distant pastures, representing decades of careful breeding and business acumen. His barns and outbuildings stretched across the valley floor like a small town, housing equipment, feed, and the infrastructure of a modern ranching operation. Everything a man could want, everything he'd worked for since Samuel's death, had left him alone in the world. But wealth, Clayton had learned, was a cold comfort on nights like this, when the wind sang lonely songs through the pines, and memories insisted on visiting whether they were welcome or not. Success had given him respect, influence, and security, but it had never filled the hole left by the loss of his only brother. Nothing could do that. A sound from upstairs broke through his brooding thoughts. The stranger was stirring again, perhaps finally emerging from the fever that had held him for days. Clayton checked the fire, ensuring it would burn through the night, then climbed the stairs to the guest room. Whatever secrets his unexpected visitor carried, whatever brought him to collapse, half dead in the Montana snow, Clayton would know soon enough. The answers, when they came, would change everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, and the choices that had shaped the man he'd become. But for now, all Clayton could do was tend to a dying stranger and wonder why the man's face seemed so hauntingly familiar in the shifting shadows of the firelight. Clayton was halfway up the stairs when he heard it, a voice so achingly familiar that his hand froze on the banister and his heart nearly stopped beating. The stranger was speaking, no longer the incoherent muttering of fever, but clear words that cut through the silence of the lodge like a blade through his chest. Clayboy, is that you?" The childhood nickname hit him like a physical blow. Only one person had ever called him that, Samuel, his younger brother, who'd tagged along behind him through their boyhood adventures in these same mountains. Clayton's legs suddenly felt weak, and he gripped the railing to steady himself before forcing his feet to carry him the rest of the way up. The guest room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, casting dancing shadows across the pine walls. The stranger was awake, propped up against the pillows Clayton had arranged for his comfort. In the lamplight, the resemblance was unmistakable now that Clayton was looking for it. The same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes that had run in the Reese family for generations, though now marked by years of hardship and suffering. "Samuel!" Clayton's voice came out as a whisper, barely audible above the crackling of logs in the fireplace downstairs. The man's weathered face creased into a ghost of the boyish grin Clayton remembered from their youth. "Hello, big brother. Been a while, hasn't it?" Clayton sank into the chair beside the bed, his mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Samuel was dead. He'd seen the newspaper reports, attended the funeral, or what passed for one when there was no body to bury. The town had erected a simple marker in the cemetery with Samuel's name and the dates of his too short life. Clayton had visited it exactly once, the day after their father died. "You're dead," Clayton said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "They said you were shot down in Bannack. There were witnesses." Samuel's laugh was bitter, ending in a coughing fit that brought flecks of blood to his lips. When the spasm passed, he fixed his older brother with eyes that held 30 years of pain and secrets. "Is that what they told you? That I was just another outlaw who got what he deserved? The papers said you robbed the bank, that you were running with a gang of thieves and murderers." "The papers?" Samuel shook his head weakly. "Clay, I never robbed that bank. I was trying to stop the robbery. But by the time the smoke cleared and the real story could be told, I was already supposed to be dead." Clayton felt the room spinning around him. Nothing about this made sense. Samuel looked older than his 55 years, worn down by decades of hard living, but he was undeniably alive. "Then where have you been? Why didn't you come home? Father died thinking his son was a criminal." Pain flickered across Samuel's features, a deeper hurt than any physical wound. "I know. I wanted to come back, wanted to tell him the truth, but I couldn't. They were watching, waiting for me to surface. Coming home would have meant death for me and danger for anyone I cared about." "Who was watching?" "Samuel, you're not making sense." Samuel's hand moved beneath the blanket, and he pulled out something that made Clayton's breath catch. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age and stained with what looked like dried blood. The delicate piece of jewelry seemed out of place in his brother's weathered fingers, but Clayton recognized it immediately. It had belonged to their mother. "She gave this to me the day before she died," Samuel said, pressing the locket into Clayton's palm. "Told me to keep it close, said it would protect me when times got dark. I've carried it for 30 years, through everything that's happened." Clayton opened the locket with trembling fingers. Inside was a photograph of their parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful, and beside it a small lock of hair their mothers preserved all these years. But it was the inscription on the opposite side that made his hands shake. "For my boys, that they might always find their way home." "Samuel, I don't understand. If you're alive, if you're innocent, why didn't you?" "Because I was framed, Clay." set up by people I trusted, people who needed a scapegoat for their crimes. And when I tried to clear my name, when I started asking the wrong questions of the wrong people, they made it clear that staying dead was my only option. The weight of Samuel's words settled over Clayton like a shroud. His brother, the boy who'd taught him to fish in the mountain streams, who'd stood beside him at their parents' graves, who dreamed of making something of himself in the wide-open territory, had spent 30 years as a hunted man. "Who did this to you?" Clayton's voice was hard now, the tone he used when conducting business with men who'd crossed him. Samuel's eyes grew distant, focused on memories that still brought pain. Men who are still out there, still powerful. Men who thought a young cowboy was the perfect fall guy for their schemes. They staged my death in that shootout, had someone wearing my clothes take a bullet in the back where his face couldn't be seen clearly. By the time anyone could examine the body closely, it was buried, and I was miles away with a new name and a bounty on my head. And you've been running ever since. Running, hiding, trying to stay one step ahead of killers who want to make sure the truth never comes out. Samuel coughed again, the sound wet and painful. I've been shot at, hunted like an animal, forced to live in caves and line shacks just to survive. But I never stopped gathering evidence, never stopped trying to find a way to clear my name and come home. Clayton felt anger building in his chest, a cold, focused rage, unlike anything he'd experienced since the night he'd learned of Samuel's supposed death. Someone had stolen 30 years from his family, had destroyed their father with lies and grief, had torn apart everything the Reese name had once stood for. "They're still looking for you," he said, remembering Samuel's fevered ramblings about people pursuing him. "Got close this time, too close, had to abandon everything and run for the high country. Figured if I was going to die, I'd rather it be in these mountains, where we played as boys, than in some god-forsaken hole with strangers." Samuel's voice was growing weaker, the effort of talking clearly taking its toll. "Didn't expect to make it as far as I did. Certainly didn't expect to run into my big brother." Clayton gripped his brother's hand, feeling the calluses and scars of 3 decades of hardship. "You're safe now. Whatever it takes, whoever these people are. They'll have to go through me to get to you." Samuel smiled, and for a moment Clayton saw a flash of the young man who'd followed him on adventures through these same mountains. "You always were the protective one, Clay. But these aren't cattle rustlers or claim jumpers you can intimidate with lawyers and money. These are dangerous men with long memories and longer reach. Then we'll deal with them together. The Reese family has survived worse. Have we?" Samuel's eyes were closing, exhaustion pulling him back towards sleep. "Sometimes I wonder if we ever really recovered from what they did to us. Look at you, Clay, successful beyond anything we could have imagined as boys, but living alone in this big house with nothing but ghosts for company." The observation stung because it was true. Clayton had spent 30 years building an empire, but he'd never built a family, never found someone to share his success with, never had children to carry on the name he'd worked so hard to restore. He'd been so focused on honoring the dead that he'd forgotten how to live. "Rest now," Clayton said quietly. "We'll figure out what comes next when you're stronger." But even as Samuel's breathing deepened into sleep, Clayton knew their troubles were far from over. His brother had brought more than just painful memories to his mountain lodge. He'd brought danger. And somewhere out there in the darkness, the men who'd destroyed his family once were still hunting, still determined to keep their secrets buried, along with the truth about Samuel Reese. Clayton barely slept that night, every creak of the lodge settling, every gust of wind against the windows. Every distant sound from the mountains beyond made him reach for the Winchester rifle he'd placed beside his bed. If Samuel's pursuers had tracked him this far, they might already be closing in on the lodge. The thought of losing his brother again, this time permanently, filled Clayton with a cold determination he hadn't felt since the early days of building his empire. Dawn broke grey and bitter over the Bitterroot Range, and Clayton was already in his study, surrounded by wooden file cabinets and leather-bound ledgers that documented his business dealings. But this morning he wasn't interested in cattle prices or land acquisitions. He was searching through a different kind of record, the collection of old newspapers, legal documents, and correspondence he'd kept from the aftermath of Samuel's supposed death. The yellowed newspaper clipping he was looking for sat buried in a manila envelope marked Family 1845 to 1895. Clayton spread it carefully on his desk, the paper brittle with age. The headline was stark and damning: Local man killed in Bannock Bank, robbery attempt. Below it, a grainy photograph showed the aftermath of the shooting, bodies covered with sheets in front of the bank building. But as Clayton read the article with fresh eyes, details that had seemed unimportant 30 years ago now stood out like warning flags. The reporter's description of the dead robber was vague: a man of medium height with dark hair, approximately 25 years of age. No mention of identifying marks, scars, or any of the distinctive features that would have made Samuel recognizable to anyone who knew him. More troubling was the timeline. The article stated that the robbery occurred at 3:30 in the afternoon, but the witnesses quoted gave conflicting accounts. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, who ran the boarding house across from the bank, swore she saw the gunman enter at well past 4 o'clock. Thomas Brennan, the bank clerk, insisted it was no later than 3:15. Such discrepancies might seem minor, but Clayton's years of reading contracts and legal documents had taught him to notice when stories didn't align. The list of witnesses was equally suspicious. Of the 6 people quoted in the article, Clayton recognized only 2 names, Hartwell and Brennan. The others were strangers, despite the fact that Bannock was a small town where everyone knew everyone else. Had these mysterious witnesses disappeared as quickly as they'd appeared? And if so, why? Clayton pulled out his father's correspondence from the same period. Letters written in Sheriff William Reese's careful hand to colleagues in other towns, inquiring about the men Samuel was supposed to have been running with. The responses painted a picture that didn't match the newspaper account. According to lawmen in Virginia City and Helena, no gang matching the description given in the Bannock incident had been operating in the territory. The alleged accomplices were either completely unknown or had solid alibis for the time of the robbery. "You found something?" Samuel's voice from the doorway made Clayton look up from the documents. His brother was leaning heavily against the frame, having made his way downstairs despite his weakened condition. In daylight, the resemblance between them was even stronger, though Samuel's face bore the weathered look of a man who'd spent decades living rough. "The newspaper account of your death," Clayton said, gesturing for Samuel to take the chair across from his desk. "There are inconsistencies I never noticed before, details that don't add up." Samuel lowered himself into the chair with obvious effort. "Father always said you had the sharpest eye in the family when it came to spotting lies. What did you find?" Clayton walked him through the discrepancies, the conflicting timeline, the unknown witnesses, the mysterious gang that no other lawmen had heard of. With each point, Samuel's expression grew grimmer. "It was all staged," Samuel said when Clayton finished. "Every bit of it. They needed witnesses to swear I was there, needed a body that could pass for mine from a distance, needed a story that would satisfy anyone asking questions. But why you? What made you a target?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the snow-covered mountains where they'd hunted and explored as boys. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and older regrets. "I was working for the territorial government that summer, carrying dispatches between mining camps and the capital. Routine work, or so I thought. But one of those dispatches contained information about mineral surveys, locations of new silver and gold deposits that hadn't been made public yet." Clayton felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to click into place. Inside information, worth a fortune to the right people. Exactly. Someone was passing details about the richest strikes to investors before the claims could be filed properly. I started noticing patterns in the dispatches I was carrying, started asking questions I shouldn't have asked. And someone decided you knew too much. More than that. They decided I was getting too close to identifying who was behind the scheme, so they arranged for Samuel Reese to die in a bank robbery, making sure I could never testify about what I'd seen or suspected. Clayton leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the implications. The people behind this, they had enough influence to stage a fake robbery, plant witnesses, and convince the territorial authorities that you were dead. That takes serious power and connections. Power they still have, Samuel said grimly. I've spent 30 years trying to gather evidence against them, and every time I get close, they find out. They have people everywhere, lawmen, judges, businessmen who seem respectable on the surface but take their orders from someone higher up the chain. A cold certainty was settling in Clayton's gut. They're still operating, still stealing from honest miners and settlers, still getting rich off information that should be public, still destroying anyone who gets in their way. Samuel coughed, the sound harsh in the quiet study. And now they know I'm alive again. My showing up in these mountains, it's going to stir up old fears, old paranoia. They'll come for me, Clay. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but they'll come. Clayton stood and walked to his gun cabinet, selecting a double-barreled shotgun and checking its condition. Let them come. This isn't 1865, and I'm not some green kid they can intimidate. You don't understand what you're up against. These aren't common criminals. They have resources, organization, patience. They've been at this for decades. So have I, Clayton said quietly. Building this ranch, making the right connections, learning who has real power in this territory. You think I got where I am by being naive about how the game is played? Samuel studied his older brother with new appreciation. The boy who'd protected him from schoolyard bullies had grown into a man who commanded respect across Montana territory. You've changed, Clay. Gotten harder. I had to. After you died, after I thought you died, and Father followed you to the grave, I swore the Reese name would never be associated with failure or shame again. I've spent 30 years making sure of that. And now I'm back to drag you into the same mess that got me killed the first time. Clayton met his brother's eyes with steady resolve. Now you're back so we can finish what someone else started. Together, the way it should have been from the beginning. Outside, snow began falling again, and somewhere in the distance, Clayton thought he heard the sound of horses on the mountain trail. The hunt for Samuel Reese was about to begin again, but this time he wouldn't be facing it alone. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, and Clayton moved to the window, peering through the frost-covered glass at the trail winding up from the valley below. 3 riders were making their way toward the lodge, their horses laboring through the deep snow. Even at this distance, something about their purposeful approach set Clayton's nerves on edge. "Samuel," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the approaching men. "How long since you lost them?" His brother struggled to his feet and joined Clayton at the window. When he saw the riders, his face went pale. 2 days, maybe less. I thought the storm would cover my tracks, but they're better trackers than you hoped." Clayton was already moving, grabbing Samuel's arm to steady him. "Can you walk? Really walk? Not just stumble around the lodge?" "I can manage, if I have to." "You have to." Clayton guided his brother toward the back of the house, his mind racing through options. The lodge had been designed with multiple exits, a precaution from his early days when disgruntled competitors had occasionally made threats. "There's a root cellar behind the kitchen. Hidden entrance through the pantry floor. You can—" "No." Samuel pulled back, surprising Clayton with his firmness. "I'm done running and hiding. 30 years is enough. This isn't the time for pride. Those men out there will kill you too if they think you're helping me." Samuel reached inside his coat and pulled out something that made Clayton catch his breath. It was a piece of parchment, old and carefully folded, with what looked like a hand-drawn map sketched across its surface. Before I die, and I will die, Clay, we both know that you need to see this. The map fragment showed a section of the Bitterroot Mountains that Clayton recognized, marked with landmarks he'd known since childhood: Bear Creek, Devil's Backbone Ridge, the old mining camp at Prospect Gulch. But there were additional markings in a different hand, symbols and notations that meant nothing to him. I found this sewn into the lining of my coat after the shooting in Bannack, Samuel explained, his voice urgent as the hoofbeats drew nearer. Took me years to figure out what it meant, but it's a map to where they buried the evidence. All of it documents, correspondence, records of every crooked deal they've made. Clayton studied the map more closely, recognizing his brother's painstaking additions to the original drawing. You've been following this for 30 years. Trying to. Every time I got close to the location, they'd find me and I'd have to run again. But I memorized every detail, added my own notes when I could. This map is the key to everything, Clay. The proof that could clear my name and bring down the whole corrupt network. The hoofbeats had stopped. Through the window, Clayton could see the three men dismounting near his front porch. They moved with the efficiency of professionals, men who'd done this kind of work before. One stayed with the horses, while the other two approached the lodge. They look official enough, Clayton observed, noting the badges glinting on their coats. But if they were legitimate lawmen, they'd have announced themselves by now. Samuel tucked the map fragment back inside his shirt. Corrupt badges are easy to come by when you have the right connections. Half the territorial marshals are on someone's payroll. A sharp knock echoed through the lodge, followed by a voice that carried the authority of legal mandate. Mr. Reese, this is Deputy Marshal Crawford. We need to speak with you about a fugitive who may be in the area. Clayton met his brother's eyes. Crawford. You know that name? One of them. Been hunting me for 20 years, maybe longer. He's good at his job, which makes him very dangerous. Samuel's hand moved to the pistol tucked in his belt, an old Colt Navy that looked well-maintained despite its age. Whatever you do, don't let him get behind you. Mr. Reese. The voice came again, more insistent. We know you're in there. We just want to ask a few questions. Clayton straightened his vest and walked toward the front door, projecting the calm confidence of a man who had nothing to hide. He'd dealt with territorial officials before, and most could be managed with the right combination of courtesy and implied influence. He opened the door to find two men standing on his porch, one tall and lean with predatory eyes, the other shorter and stockier, with the build of an ex-soldier. Both wore deputy marshal badges and long coats that could easily conceal weapons. Gentlemen, Clayton said pleasantly. Clayton Reese, what can I do for you? The tall man, presumably Crawford, touched the brim of his hat. Appreciate your time, Mr. Reese. We're tracking a dangerous fugitive who was spotted in this area 2 days ago. Man named Samuel Reese. Any relation? Clayton kept his expression neutral, though his heart was racing. Samuel Reese was my brother. He's been dead for 30 years. That's what the records say, Crawford agreed. But sometimes records can be incomplete. We have reason to believe the man we're hunting has been using your brother's name as an alias. I see. And what makes you think this fugitive came through my property? The shorter deputy spoke up for the first time. Tracks in the snow, Mr. Reese, leading right up to your front door. Fresh tracks, no more than 3 days old. Clayton nodded thoughtfully. I did find an injured traveler on my property a few days ago. Brought him up to the lodge to recover from exposure. Crawford's eyes sharpened with interest. This traveler, where is he now? Died yesterday evening. Pneumonia, most likely. The cold was too much for him. Clayton delivered the lie with practiced ease, the same tone he used when negotiating cattle prices or land deals. I was planning to take the body into town tomorrow for burial. That's unfortunate, Crawford said, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. We'd like to see the body, if you don't mind, just to confirm it's not the man we're hunting. Clayton hesitated just long enough to seem reluctant rather than suspicious. "Of course, though I should warn you, it's not a pleasant sight. I wrapped the body and stored it in the root cellar to keep it from the animals." "We understand," Crawford said. "We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Reese." As Clayton led the two deputies around the side of the lodge toward the root cellar, he caught a glimpse of movement in an upstairs window. Samuel was watching, probably positioning himself for whatever came next. His brother might be weakened by years of running and recent injuries, but Clayton suspected he was far from helpless. The question was whether Clayton's improvised plan would buy them enough time to figure out their next move, or if they were both about to discover just how far these men were willing to go to keep their secrets buried. Clayton led the two deputies to the root cellar, his mind working frantically to maintain the deception while keeping them away from Samuel. The wooden doors set into the hillside behind the lodge looked appropriately grim in the grey morning light, and the deputies followed without apparent suspicion. "Been using this cellar for storage since I built the lodge," Clayton explained as he lifted the heavy doors. "Keeps things from freezing, and the animals can't get to anything stored down here." The cellar was dark and cold, lined with shelves that held preserved foods, tools, and supplies for the long mountain winters. Clayton had hastily arranged some blankets and an old tarp in the far corner to suggest a wrapped body, hoping the deputies wouldn't look too closely. Crawford descended the stone steps, his boots echoing in the confined space. His partner remained at the entrance, hand resting casually near his weapon. The arrangement suggested they'd done this kind of search before and knew how to cover each other. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Crawford asked, though he was already moving toward the makeshift bundle. "Go ahead," Clayton replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Though I warn you, he wasn't pretty when he died." Crawford knelt beside the tarp-covered form and began to unwrap it. For a moment, Clayton's heart stopped as he realized his deception would be exposed within seconds. But luck intervened in the form of a commotion from outside, horses whinnying and the sound of the third deputy calling out in alarm. "Crawford!" The man's voice carried urgency. The deputy marshal's head snapped up, his investigation forgotten. "Stay here," he told his partner, then climbed quickly back to ground level. Clayton followed, grateful for the interruption, but wondering what new complications were heading his way. 4 horsemen were indeed approaching the lodge, but these weren't more hunters. They were Clayton's own men, led by his foreman Jake Morrison. The weathered cowboy was riding hard, his face grim with purpose. "Mr. Reese," Jake called out as soon as he was within earshot. "We got trouble down in the south pasture. Cattle rustlers hit us during the night. Took near 200 head. Clayton felt a moment of genuine alarm. Cattle rustling was a serious crime in Montana territory, and losing that many animals would cost him thousands of dollars. But as Jake drew closer, Clayton caught something in his foreman's expression, a subtle signal they'd worked out years ago when dealing with unwanted visitors. "Rustlers?" Crawford interjected, his marshal's badge giving him authority to involve himself. "We should coordinate our efforts, Mr. Reese. Cattle theft is a federal matter in these parts." Jake dismounted and approached, nodding respectfully to the deputies while keeping his eyes on Clayton. "Found the tracks heading southeast toward the Badlands. Trails fresh enough to follow if we move quick." Clayton understood. Jake had spotted the deputies from a distance and concocted the rustling story to provide an excuse for Clayton to leave the lodge and to bring armed men who could even the odds if trouble started. "I'll need to ride out and assess the damage," Clayton told Crawford. "Cattle rustling is my livelihood, deputy. I'm sure you understand." Crawford looked torn between pursuing his investigation of the supposed body in the root cellar and maintaining his cover as a legitimate lawman. A real deputy marshal would indeed be concerned about cattle rustling, and refusing to help would raise questions about his priorities. "Perhaps we should postpone examining the deceased," Crawford said carefully. "Cattle thieves are a more immediate threat to the community." "My thoughts exactly," Clayton agreed. "Jake, how many men do we have available?" 8 riders ready to go, Mr. Reese." all armed and provisioned for a long chase if need be. Clayton nodded, then turned back to Crawford. "You're welcome to join us, Deputy, though I should mention my men shoot first and ask questions later when it comes to rustlers. Territorial law gives us that right on our own land." The threat was subtle but clear. Crawford would be riding into hostile territory with men loyal to Clayton, men who wouldn't hesitate to protect their employer if necessary. The deputy's calculating eyes showed he understood the implications. "I appreciate the offer," Crawford said after a moment. "But we have our own investigation to complete. We'll continue tracking the fugitive we've been pursuing. Of course, though if you need to examine that body in the cellar, you're welcome to return tomorrow. He'll keep in this cold." Crawford nodded curtly. "We may do that. Good luck with your rustlers, Mr. Reese." Clayton watched as the three deputies mounted their horses and rode back down the trail, their official demeanor not quite masking their frustration at being outmaneuvered. Only when they were well out of sight did he turn to Jake Morrison. "There were no rustlers," he said quietly. "No, sir," Jake agreed. "But there were 3 armed men asking questions about the lodge, and that didn't sit right with me, especially when I recognized one of them. You know Crawford?" "Not Crawford, the short one with the soldier build. Name's Garrett. Used to work security for some mining interests down in Virginia City. Had a reputation for making problems disappear, if you know what I mean." Clayton felt pieces clicking into place. Mining interests, territorial corruption, men with flexible ethics, it all connected to what Samuel had told him about the conspiracy that had destroyed his life. "Jake, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to not ask questions about why." The foreman nodded. In 20 years of working together, Jake had learned that Clayton Reese didn't make requests lightly. "What do you need?" "Send word to town. Quietly. Find out what you can about Deputy Marshal Crawford and his men. When they arrived, who sent them, what their official business is supposed to be. But be careful if I'm right about what's going on. Asking the wrong questions to the wrong people could get you killed." "Understood, Mr. Reese." "And Jake, have the men patrol the property in shifts, armed patrols. Anyone approaches the lodge without permission, they're to be turned away, by force if necessary." Jake's weathered face creased with concern. "Expecting more trouble?" Clayton looked back at the lodge, knowing Samuel was somewhere inside, probably watching from a window and wondering if his presence had just signed his brother's death warrant. "I'm expecting a war, Jake. The question is whether we'll be ready for it when it comes." As Jake rode off to organize the patrols and gather information, Clayton realized he was committed now. There was no backing down, no pretending this was someone else's fight. The conspiracy that had destroyed Samuel 30 years ago was still active, still dangerous, and still determined to keep their secrets buried. But this time, they weren't dealing with a lone young man with no resources or connections. This time, they were dealing with Clayton Reese, and he'd spent 30 years learning how to fight wars and win them. Clayton found Samuel in his study, standing before the fireplace with something clutched in his weathered hands. The afternoon light filtering through the windows cast deep shadows across his brother's face, making him look older than his years and infinitely weary. "They're gone for now," Clayton said, closing the door behind him. "But they'll be back." Samuel turned, and Clayton saw he was holding a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. The book looked like it had traveled thousands of miles and survived hardships that would have destroyed lesser objects. "I heard voices," Samuel said. "Sounded like you convinced them I was dead. For the moment, my foreman created a distraction about cattle rustlers, gave me an excuse to have armed men around. But Crawford isn't stupid. He'll figure out the deception eventually." Samuel held up the journal. "Then we don't have much time. You need to see what's in here before they come back." Clayton accepted the book, noting how the leather binding was cracked and stained, held together with careful stitching that spoke of makeshift repairs done in hiding places and camps. The pages inside were covered with Samuel's careful handwriting, mixed with sketches, maps, and what looked like copied documents. 30 years, Samuel said quietly. 30 years of running, hiding, gathering evidence piece by piece. Every name, every date, every connection I could find between the men who framed me and the corruption that's been eating at this territory like a cancer. Clayton opened the journal and began reading. The first entries were from 1865, written in the shaky hand of a young man traumatized by betrayal and violence. Samuel had documented everything he could remember about the fake bank robbery, the planted evidence, the mysterious witnesses who disappeared as quickly as they'd appeared. But as the entries progressed through the years, they revealed a much larger picture. Samuel had spent decades tracking the network of corruption that had destroyed his life, following trails of evidence from one mining camp to another, one territorial office to the next. The conspiracy wasn't just about stealing mineral survey information, it was about controlling the entire development of Montana territory. "Look at the names," Samuel said, pointing to a list written in his more mature hand from the 1880 seconds. Judge Harrison, who's been deciding mineral claims for 15 years. Sheriff Morrison in Helena, no relation to your Jake, I checked. Territorial Commissioner Williams. All of them taking money to ensure the right people get the rights to the richest claims. Clayton studied the names, recognizing several as men he'd dealt with in his own business ventures. Men who'd seemed respectable, even admirable, but who, according to Samuel's evidence, were part of an organized system of theft and corruption. They've been stealing from honest miners and settlers for decades, Samuel continued. Getting advance information about survey results, then ensuring their confederates get first crack at filing claims. Anyone who gets in their way or asks too many questions, well, they either disappear or have unfortunate accidents. Clayton turned more pages, finding copies of documents that Samuel had somehow acquired over the years. Letters discussing payoffs, coded telegrams, arranging for specific claims to be approved or denied, even what appeared to be a partial list of bank accounts where bribes were deposited. "How did you get all this?" Samuel's smile was bitter. 30 years of living like a ghost gives you advantages. You learn to be invisible, to go places honest men can't go, to overhear conversations meant for no one's ears. I've worked as a stable hand for corrupt judges, a camp cook for crooked surveyors, a gravedigger who heard confessions meant for dead ears. One document in particular caught Clayton's attention, a letter dated just 5 years earlier, discussing the need to finalize the Reese matter permanently. The implications made his blood run cold. "They never stopped looking for you. Never stopped worrying that I might surface with evidence. Every few years, they'd send someone new to hunt for my trail. Crawford's just the latest in a long line of killers with badges." Clayton reached the most recent entries in the journal, written in a hand that showed the strain of illness and exhaustion. Samuel had been getting closer to exposing the conspiracy, but his pursuers had finally gotten too close for him to continue. "There's something else," Samuel said, his voice heavy with old pain. "Something about Father." Clayton looked up sharply. "What about Father?" "He didn't die of a broken heart, Clay. He was getting too close to the truth about my supposed death. Started asking the right questions of the wrong people. Look at the entry from October 1865. Clayton found the page and read Samuel's careful documentation of their father's final weeks. Sheriff William Reese had indeed been investigating his son's alleged crimes, but not to clear the family name. He'd been trying to understand why none of the evidence made sense. He'd identified the same inconsistencies Clayton had found in the newspaper accounts, had started tracking down the mysterious witnesses, had even begun to suspect that Samuel might still be alive. "They poisoned him," Samuel said flatly. "Made it look like a heart attack. But he was healthy as a horse before he started that investigation. I have a source who saw them slip something into his coffee during a meeting at the territorial office." The journal felt heavy in Clayton's hands, not just from the weight of paper and leather, but from the accumulated evidence of decades of corruption and murder. His family hadn't just been victims of a simple frame-up. They'd been targeted for elimination by people who saw them as threats to a profitable criminal enterprise. "Why didn't you ever try to contact me? Send word somehow?" Samuel walked to the window, looking out at the mountains where they'd played as children. "Because I knew they were watching you too. Every letter you wrote, every business dealing you made, every person you associated with, they wanted to make sure Samuel Reese's family never caused them trouble again. But I built my fortune legitimately. Did you?" Samuel turned back to face him, his expression sympathetic but firm. "Look at the list of territorial contracts you've been awarded over the years. The land deals that went your way, the legal disputes that were decided in your favor. How many of those involved judges or officials whose names appear in that journal?" Clayton felt the ground shifting beneath him as he considered the implications. His empire, built through what he'd thought was his own skill and determination, might have been shaped by the same corrupt network that had destroyed his brother's life. "They let you succeed, Clay. Made sure you prospered, because a wealthy, respectable Clayton Reese was the best possible proof that Samuel Reese was really dead and the family had moved on. You were their insurance policy, living evidence that justice had been served." The weight of 30 years of misdirected gratitude and pride settled on Clayton's shoulders like a crushing burden. Everything he'd achieved, everything he'd thought he'd earned through hard work and smart decisions, might have been nothing more than an elaborate deception designed to keep him quiet and compliant. But if that was true, then the men who'd stolen his family and corrupted his success had made a serious miscalculation. They'd given him the resources and connections to fight back, and now they were going to learn what those resources could accomplish in the hands of a man who had nothing left to lose. Samuel reached into his coat with trembling fingers and withdrew something that made Clayton's breath catch. It was a small brass key, tarnished with age, but unmistakably the type used for bank safety deposit boxes. The sight of it sent a chill through Clayton that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "There's more," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I've shown you, the journal, the evidence I've gathered, it's just the beginning. The real proof is locked away where they could never find it, no matter how hard they hunted." Clayton stared at the key. A safety deposit box. But where and how? "Helena, First National Bank, box number 247, registered under the name James Morrison. I borrowed your foreman's surname. Figured it would be ironic if I had to hide evidence under the name of an honest man." Samuel's laugh was bitter. "I've been making deposits there for 28 years. Every time I uncovered something new, documents, photographs, sworn statements from people who witnessed their crimes, but were too scared to come forward publicly." "What kind of evidence?" Samuel's eyes grew distant, focused on memories that still brought him pain. The kind that would hang half the territorial government and put the other half in prison for the rest of their lives, including the evidence about Father's murder and about who really ordered it. Clayton felt the world shifting around him again. Who? Judge Harrison wasn't just taking bribes, Clay. He was running the whole operation, has been since before we were born. Every crooked deal, every stolen claim, every person who died or disappeared, it all traced back to him. But Harrison was smart enough to never get his hands dirty directly. "Then, how did you—" "Because I found someone who was there when they planned Father's murder. A man named Thomas Brennan." Clayton's memory snapped to attention. "The bank clerk from Bannack, the one who witnessed your supposed death." "The same. Turns out Brennan had a crisis of conscience about 20 years ago. Too much drinking, too many nightmares about the people he'd helped destroy. He reached out to me through intermediaries, wanted to make amends for his part in the frame-up." Samuel walked to Clayton's desk and pulled out a map of Montana Territory, spreading it across the surface. "Brennan told me everything. How Harrison recruited him as a young man, how the network operated, how they decided who lived and who died. But most importantly, he told me about a meeting in 1865 where Harrison gave specific orders about dealing with the Reese problem. Clayton leaned over the map as Samuel pointed to various locations. Father was getting too close to proving I was innocent. He'd identified most of the planted witnesses, figured out the timeline didn't work, and was starting to ask questions about territorial mineral surveys. Harrison couldn't risk him uncovering the whole conspiracy, so they killed him. With poison slipped into his coffee during a meeting about territorial security. Harrison did it himself, wanted to make sure it was done right. Brennan was in the room, keeping watch, and he heard every word Harrison spoke about making the death look natural. Clayton felt rage building in his chest, a cold, focused anger unlike anything he'd experienced in 30 years. Where's Brennan now? Dead. Natural causes as far as anyone knows, but he lived long enough to give me a sworn statement describing everything he witnessed. It's in that safety deposit box, along with documents proving Harrison has been skimming money from territorial budgets, correspondence showing how they decide which mining claims to approve, and a list of every person they've murdered to protect their operation. The brass key seemed to grow heavier in Clayton's palm as he considered the implications. This evidence, it could destroy them completely. Destroy them and everyone connected to them. Which brings us to the part you're not going to want to hear. Samuel's voice grew gentle, the tone their father had used when delivering hard truths. Clay, your business empire, a lot of it was built with dirty money. Clayton had suspected this might be coming, but hearing it stated directly still felt like a physical blow. How much of it? Most of it. The land grants that got you started, the territorial contracts that made you wealthy, the legal decisions that went your way. When you were acquiring property, Harrison orchestrated all of it. He wanted to make sure you prospered, because a successful Clayton Reese was proof that the family had moved on from Samuel's disgrace. Samuel pulled documents from the map case, spreading them across the desk. Look at this correspondence between Harrison and territorial officials, discussing how to manage the surviving Reese brother. They've been guiding your success for 30 years, making sure you got opportunities and favorable treatment. Clayton examined the documents with growing horror. Letters discussing his applications for grazing rights, his bids on territorial contracts, even his legal disputes with neighboring ranchers, all of it had been influenced by Harrison's network. What he'd thought was his own business acumen had been largely an illusion, carefully maintained to serve someone else's purposes. They turned me into their unwitting accomplice. Worse than that, they turned you into their insurance policy. Every time someone questioned whether Samuel Reese was really guilty, they could point to his successful, respectable brother as proof that justice had been served. Why would Clayton Reese be doing so well if there was any doubt about Samuel's crimes? The realization hit Clayton like a physical blow. His success hadn't just been built on dirty money, it had been used as evidence to justify his brother's supposed crimes and their father's murder. Every achievement, every moment of pride in what he'd built, had been tainted by blood and corruption. There's more. Samuel's voice was barely audible now. The current territorial governor, the man who's been signing off on your business permits and land deals, he's Harrison's nephew, appointed specifically to keep the family business running smoothly. Clayton sank into his chair, the weight of 30 years of misdirected ambition crushing down on him. Everything I've worked for, everything I thought I'd achieved, was real in its own way. You still had to make the right decisions, still had to manage the business, still had to be smart enough to take advantage of the opportunities they gave you. But yes, the opportunities themselves were manufactured. Why are you telling me this? Why not just let me keep believing I'd earned it honestly? Samuel's expression softened with something approaching affection. Because we're going to destroy them, Clay. All of them. And when we do, you need to understand what you'll be giving up. Your empire, your reputation, probably your freedom, it's all built on their foundation. Taking them down means taking yourself down too. Clayton looked at the brass key in his palm, then at the evidence spread across his desk. 30 years of corruption, murder, and manipulation, all carefully documented and ready to be exposed. But exposure would mean the end of everything he'd spent his life building. The choice is yours, Samuel continued. We can destroy this evidence, and you can keep your empire. I'll disappear again, let them think I'm dead for real this time. You'll go back to your comfortable life, and the corruption will continue. Or we expose everything and let the consequences fall where they may, knowing that you'll lose everything you've worked for, knowing that your name will be associated with the same scandal that destroyed me 30 years ago. Clayton stood and walked to the window, looking out at the vast expanse of land that bore his name. Thousands of cattle, hundreds of workers, a legacy that had taken decades to build. All of it about to be revealed as a monument to his own unwitting complicity in his family's destruction. But as he stood there, something his father had once told him came back with crystal clarity. A man's worth isn't measured by what he owns. Son, it's measured by what he's willing to sacrifice for what's right. Clayton turned back to Samuel, his decision made. When do we go to Helena? Rum. Clayton spent that evening in his father's old room, a space he'd preserved exactly as Sheriff William Reese had left it 30 years ago. On the nightstand beside the bed sat their father's service revolver, a Colt Army model that had seen action in more than a dozen confrontations with outlaws and claim jumpers. Clayton picked up the weapon, checking its condition with the practiced ease of a man who'd learned to handle firearms before he could properly read. The revolver was clean and well-maintained, though it hadn't been fired since his father's death. Clayton had kept it oiled and loaded, telling himself it was out of respect for his father's memory. But now he understood it had been preparation for this moment when the family's fight for justice would finally be finished. Samuel appeared in the doorway, moving more steadily than he had since arriving. 2 days of rest and proper food had begun to restore some of his strength, though Clayton could see the illness still burning in his brother's eyes. "You're planning something," Samuel observed, noting the revolver in Clayton's hands. "We both are. The question is whether you're strong enough for what comes next." Samuel entered the room and sat heavily in their father's old chair. "I've been running and hiding for 30 years, Clay. I'm tired of it. Whatever we do, however this ends, I'd rather face it standing up than spend what's left of my life looking over my shoulder." Clayton nodded, understanding the sentiment completely. "Then we do this right. No more running, no more hiding. We expose the truth and let the consequences fall where they may, even knowing it will destroy everything you've built." "Everything I thought I'd built," Clayton corrected. "If it was all based on their corruption, then it was never really mine to begin with." Samuel studied his older brother with new respect. "You've changed, Clay. The boy I remember would have tried to find a compromise, a way to protect what he had. That boy died the night you supposedly did. What you see now is what 30 years of guilt and misdirected ambition created." Clayton holstered the revolver and turned to face Samuel directly. "Now tell me exactly what we're dealing with. How many people are involved in this conspiracy? How far does it reach?" Samuel pulled out a folded paper from his coat, a list he'd been compiling for decades. "Active participants that I can prove. At least 20 men in positions of authority. Judge Harrison at the top, then Governor Patterson, that's Harrison's nephew, Sheriff Morrison in Helena, 4 territorial commissioners, half a dozen bank presidents, and various clerks and enforcers like Crawford." 20 men, Clayton mused. "That's not an army. It's manageable. Don't underestimate them. They've had 30 years to entrench themselves, 30 years to build networks and accumulate power. Harrison, in particular, has connections reaching all the way to Washington. He's been territorial judge for 25 years. And there's talk of him being appointed to the federal bench." Clayton walked to the window, looking out at his ranch hands making their evening rounds. Good men, loyal to him personally rather than to whatever corruption had helped build his empire. We'll need allies, people we can trust completely. Jake Morrison, obviously, but who else? Doc Harrison in town, no relation to the judge, before you ask. He's been fighting corruption in the Territorial Medical Board for years, would jump at the chance to expose a bigger conspiracy. And there's Father Miguel at the mission. He's seen too many of his parishioners cheated out of their claims to have any love for the current system. Samuel nodded approvingly. Good choices. We'll need witnesses when we make our move, people whose word can't be easily dismissed. About that, how exactly do we make this move? We can't just walk into Helena and start making accusations. They have too much control over the legal system. Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. The territorial legislature is meeting next week. Emergency session to discuss new mining regulations, which probably means Harrison's group is trying to pass some law that will make their stealing even easier. Perfect. Every territorial official will be in Helena at the same time, including the federal marshal from Denver. He's scheduled to attend as an observer, make sure any new regulations comply with federal law. Most importantly, he's not part of Harrison's network. I've been tracking his cases for years, and he's completely clean. Clayton felt pieces of a plan beginning to form. We expose everything at once: public testimony, documented evidence, witnesses who can't be silenced or intimidated. It's risky. Once we start talking, Harrison's people will try to stop us by any means necessary. And I mean any means, Clay. They've killed for less than this. Let them try. Clayton's voice carried the hard edge of a man who'd made his decision and was prepared to see it through. I've got 8 armed men on this property who'd follow me to hell if I asked them to. And thanks to 30 years of their help, I've got enough money to hire more if we need them. Samuel looked troubled. That's what worries me. You're thinking like a cattleman planning a range war. But this isn't about firepower, it's about truth. And truth has a way of getting buried when too many people start shooting. Then we make sure the truth gets told before the shooting starts. They spent the next hour planning their approach. Samuel would retrieve the evidence from the Helena safety deposit box while Clayton gathered their allies and prepared for a public confrontation. The timing would be crucial. They'd need to act quickly once the evidence was in hand, before Harrison's network could organize a response. There's something else we need to discuss, Samuel said as they finalized their plans. My health. I'm dying, Clay. Has been for months now, probably longer. Clayton had suspected as much, but hearing it stated directly still hit him like a blow. The coughing, the weakness, consumption. Picked it up in a mining camp last winter, and it's been eating at my lungs ever since. Doc in Butte gave me maybe 6 months, and that was 4 months ago. The revelation added urgency to everything they were planning. Samuel's time was limited, and if they were going to clear his name and expose the conspiracy, it had to happen soon. All the more reason to finish this quickly, Clayton said. All the more reason for you to be careful. I'm already dying, I've got nothing to lose, but you still have a life to live after this is over, assuming we survive it. Clayton picked up their father's revolver again, feeling the weight of history in the worn grip. Some things are more important than survival, Samuel. Some things are worth dying for. Justice, family, truth. The idea that a man shouldn't be able to destroy innocent people just because he has money and power. Samuel smiled, the first genuine smile Clayton had seen from him since their reunion. Father would be proud of you. Proud of both of us, finally. He'll be prouder when this is finished, and his murder is avenged. They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Jake Morrison's voice called from the hallway. Mr. Reese, got a visitor down in the main room. Says he's a friend of your guest. Clayton and Samuel exchanged glances. No one should know Samuel was there except the men they'd already identified as enemies. Did he give a name? Clayton called back. Thomas Garrett. Claims he's got information about some deputies who've been asking questions around town. The name sent a chill through both brothers. Garrett was the ex-soldier Samuel had recognized riding with Crawford, the one Jake had identified as having connections to mining interests. "It's a trap," Samuel said quietly. "Obviously. But it's also an opportunity." Clayton checked the loads in his father's revolver. If Garrett came alone, it means they're not ready for an all-out assault yet. They're still trying to handle this quietly, or they're setting up for something bigger. Only one way to find out. Clayton moved toward the door, then paused. "Samuel, if this goes wrong, if they take me down here tonight, promise me you'll still go to Helena. Finish what we started. I promise. But let's try to make sure it doesn't come to that." Clayton nodded and headed for the stairs, his father's gun heavy on his hip and the weight of 30 years of injustice driving him forward. Whatever Garrett wanted, whatever trap was being set, it was time for the Reese brothers to stop running and start fighting back. The final confrontation was beginning, and this time they would face it together. Clayton descended the stairs with deliberate calm, his hand resting easily near his father's revolver. Through the main room's large windows, he could see Jake and 2 other ranch hands positioned strategically around the lodge, their rifles ready but not obviously threatening. Whatever Thomas Garrett wanted, he'd walked into a situation where Clayton held most of the advantages. The man waiting in the great room was exactly as Jake had described, stocky, with the bearing of an ex-soldier and eyes that missed nothing. He stood near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back in a military parade rest, but Clayton noticed he wore his coat open for easy access to the pistol at his hip. "Mr. Garrett," Clayton said, stopping at the bottom of the stairs where he had a clear view of both his visitor and the exits. "Jake says you have information about the deputies who've been nosing around my property." Garrett nodded respectfully, but his eyes were calculating as they took in Clayton's stance and positioning. "I do indeed, Mr. Reese. Thought you might want to know what Deputy Marshal Crawford is really after up here in your mountains." "I'm listening." "Crawford isn't hunting a fugitive, Mr. Reese. He's hunting your brother Samuel. The brother who's supposed to be dead but who's been asking uncomfortable questions about certain territorial officials for the past 30 years. Clayton kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he was impressed by Garrett's direct approach. No pretense, no elaborate deception, just straight to the truth. "My brother has been dead for 30 years. "Has he?" Garrett smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then who's the man upstairs recovering from exposure? The man whose description matches Samuel Reese perfectly, right down to the scar on his left hand from a childhood accident involving your father's skinning knife?" The specific detail about the scar, something only family would know, told Clayton that Garrett's information was both accurate and dangerously complete. These people had been watching the Reese family for far longer than he'd imagined. "What do you want?" Clayton asked, abandoning the pretense. "Simple. Your brother has something that belongs to my employers. Documents, evidence, maybe some items he's collected during his years of investigation. We're prepared to offer generous compensation for the return of these materials." "And if I'm not interested in compensation?" Garrett's smile grew colder. "Then we'll take them anyway. But with compensation, everyone walks away from this. Your brother gets to disappear again, really disappear this time, somewhere warm and comfortable where consumption patients can live out their remaining time in peace. You get to keep your ranch, your reputation, your comfortable life. Nobody gets hurt." The mention of Samuel's consumption confirmed that these people knew everything about their current situation. Clayton wondered how long they'd been watching the lodge, what other preparations they might have made. And without compensation? Without compensation, things get unpleasant for everyone involved. Your ranch hands are good men, but they're not soldiers. Crawford has a dozen professionals positioned around your property right now, men who've fought in real wars and know how to end conflicts quickly. Clayton glanced toward the windows, seeing no sign of the additional men Garrett claimed were out there. But the mountains provided plenty of cover, and if these people were as well organized as they seemed, they could easily have surrounded the lodge without being detected. "How do I know you'll keep your word? That my brother will be allowed to live peacefully? Because keeping him alive and comfortable is cheaper than hunting him for another 30 years. Judge Harrison is getting old, Mr. Reese. He wants this matter resolved before he retires. A live Samuel Reese who's been bought and silenced is much more valuable than a dead Samuel Reese who becomes a martyr. Before Clayton could respond, the sound of the town hall bell began echoing across the valley, a deep bronze tolling that carried for miles in the thin mountain air. The bell only rang for emergencies or to call the community together for important announcements. Garrett's confident expression flickered with uncertainty. "What's that?" Clayton smiled, for the first time since the conversation began. "That, Mr. Garrett, is the sound of your plan falling apart." The bell continued its steady tolling, and Clayton could see riders appearing on the distant trails leading to his property. Not Crawford's men closing in, but townspeople responding to the emergency signal. Doc Harrison, Father Miguel, several respected ranchers and businessmen, the very allies Clayton and Samuel had discussed recruiting. "You see," Clayton continued, "while you've been watching my lodge, my men have been in town spreading a very interesting story about territorial corruption, about murdered lawmen, about judges who get rich by stealing from honest settlers. People are very eager to hear the evidence we've promised to present." Garrett's hand moved toward his pistol, but stopped when Jake Morrison's voice called out from the doorway. "I wouldn't if I were you. Got 5 rifles pointed at you right now." The ex-soldier's military training showed as he assessed the situation and recognized an untenable tactical position. "This isn't over, Reese." "No, it's not," Clayton agreed. "It's just beginning, and now it's going to happen in public, with witnesses, exactly the way it should have happened 30 years ago." As the town hall bell continued its urgent summons and more riders appeared on the trails, Clayton realized they'd moved beyond the point where quiet deals and private intimidation could resolve anything. The truth was about to come out, and there was nothing Harrison's network could do to stop it. The confrontation erupted with sudden violence as Crawford's hidden men emerged from the timber around the lodge. Garrett dove behind the stone fireplace as gunfire shattered the main room windows, and Clayton found himself in the middle of a battle he'd hoped to avoid. Samuel appeared at the top of the stairs, his father's old rifle in his hands, despite his weakened condition. "Clay, get down!" A bullet splintered the wooden railing beside Clayton's head as he dropped behind his leather sofa. Jake Morrison and the ranch hands were returning fire from their positions, but they were outnumbered and outgunned by Crawford's professionals. "How many?" Clayton shouted to Jake. "At least 8, maybe more. They're using the barn and outbuildings for cover." Samuel made his way down the stairs, moving with the careful precision of a man who knew he might not have many shots left in him. "We need to get to the townspeople before Crawford's men cut them off." Through the broken windows, Clayton could see the approaching riders from town had stopped at the edge of rifle range, unsure whether to advance into what was obviously a gun battle. Doc Harrison and Father Miguel were among them, along with a dozen other men whose testimony could expose the conspiracy if they lived long enough to give it. Garrett called out from behind the fireplace. "Surrender now, Reese, and we'll let the civilians ride away unharmed, like you let my father ride away." Samuel's voice was steel-hard as he took position at a window. "Like you've let honest miners and settlers live in peace for 30 years. A fresh volley of gunfire answered him, bullets chewing chunks from the log walls and sending splinters flying through the great room. Clayton worked his way toward the back of the lodge, planning to circle around and flank Crawford's position when he heard Samuel cry out. His brother had been hit, blood spreading across his shirt as he slumped against the wall. The consumption had already weakened him, and the gunshot wound was more than his failing body could handle. "Samuel!" Clayton started toward his brother, but another burst of gunfire drove him back to cover. "Stay down!" Samuel gasped, pressing a hand to his wound. "Get the evidence to those people outside. That's what matters now." Clayton felt rage building in his chest, the same cold fury that had driven him to build his empire, now focused on the men who were destroying his family for the second time. He pulled out their father's revolver and checked its loads. then reached for the family Bible that sat on the side table. The thick book was bound in worn leather, its pages yellowed with age and use. Their mother had read from it every Sunday, their father had sworn his oaths on it when he became sheriff, and it had been in the Reese family for 3 generations. Now Clayton held it in front of him as he moved toward the window where Samuel had fallen. Another bullet struck the Bible, burying itself deep in the pages but stopping short of Clayton's chest. The book had saved his life, and something about that felt like divine providence, or at least poetic justice. "Garrett," Clayton called out, "time for you and Crawford to learn what happens when you murder Reese family members." He emptied his father's revolver through the window, each shot carefully aimed at the muzzle flashes from Crawford's position. One of the hidden gunmen cried out and went silent, and Clayton saw movement as the survivors shifted to new positions. Samuel managed to reload his rifle despite his wound, his hand steady despite the blood loss. "Clay, listen to me. The safety deposit box key, it's in my coat pocket. Whatever happens here, someone has to get that evidence to Helena. You're going to get it there yourself," Clayton said, but even as he spoke the words, he could see his brother's condition deteriorating rapidly. Jake Morrison burst through the back door, his clothes torn and his face grim. "Got 3 of them, Mr. Reese, but Crawford's still out there with at least 4 more. And they're moving to cut off the road, trying to keep those townspeople from leaving or getting help." "Not if I can help it," Samuel said, struggling to his feet with obvious effort. "Clay, help me get to the front porch." "You're in no condition to." "I'm dying anyway, have been for months, but I'm not dying as a fugitive and a supposed criminal." Samuel gripped his brother's arm with surprising strength. "Help me stand up long enough to tell those people the truth." Clayton understood. Samuel wasn't just talking about making a final stand, he was talking about making a final testimony. With bullets flying and Crawford's men positioned to silence them permanently, Samuel wanted to spend his remaining moments clearing his name and exposing the conspiracy that had destroyed their family. Together, the Reese brothers moved toward the front door, the bloodied family Bible clutched in Clayton's hand and their father's weapons ready in their arms. Outside, the town hall bell had stopped ringing, but the crowd of witnesses remained, waiting to hear the truth that had been buried for 30 years. Samuel Reese died as he had lived the last 30 years of his life, speaking truth to those who would listen. With Clayton supporting him on the blood-stained porch of the mountain lodge, he gave his testimony to the assembled townspeople, his voice carrying clearly across the valley despite his failing strength. "My name is Samuel Reese," he began, each word deliberate and strong, "son of Sheriff William Reese, brother to Clayton Reese, and for 30 years a dead man walking. I stand before you today to tell the truth about territorial corruption, about murdered lawmen, and about judges who grow rich by stealing from honest settlers." The crowd had fallen silent as Samuel spoke, and even Crawford's hidden gunmen had stopped shooting, perhaps recognizing that killing him now would only validate everything he was saying. Doc Harrison and Father Miguel moved closer, their presence lending weight to Samuel's words. Samuel told them everything, the frame-up in Bannack, their father's murder, the decades of evidence he'd gathered about Harrison's network. He spoke of territorial officials who sold mining rights to the highest bidder, of witnesses who disappeared when they asked inconvenient questions, of a system so corrupt it had murdered a sheriff for doing his job. And when his voice finally gave out and the consumption claimed the last of his strength, Samuel died in his brother's arms, with his name finally cleared and the truth finally told. The aftermath came swiftly. Crawford and his surviving men, realizing they were outnumbered and exposed, attempted to flee into the mountains but were hunted down by an angry posse of ranchers and miners who'd been cheated by Harrison's network for decades. Crawford himself was captured alive, and under questioning he provided details that corroborated everything Samuel had said. Judge Harrison tried to maintain his innocence even after the evidence from the Helena safety deposit box was recovered and made public. But faced with sworn statements from Thomas Brennan, financial records showing decades of illegal payments, and testimony from dozens of victims, Even Harrison's powerful connections couldn't save him. He was arrested on federal charges and died in prison while awaiting trial. The territorial governor, Harrison's nephew, resigned in disgrace when his own involvement was revealed. Half the territorial administration was replaced in the scandal's wake, and new laws were passed requiring public disclosure of all mining surveys and territorial contracts. Clayton kept his word about accepting the consequences of his unwitting involvement in the conspiracy. He liquidated most of his ranch holdings and used the proceeds to compensate miners and settlers who'd been cheated by Harrison's network. The gesture bankrupted him financially, but restored the Reese family name to honor. 6 months after Samuel's death, Clayton stood before a simple granite monument he'd erected on a hill overlooking his remaining property. The memorial bore the names of Samuel Reese and Sheriff William Reese, with an inscription that read, "They died for truth and justice. Their sacrifice was not in vain." Doc Harrison found him there on a crisp autumn morning, the doctor having ridden up from town to check on Clayton's recovery from his own gunshot wounds received in the final battle. "How are you holding up?" the doctor asked, dismounting near the memorial. "Better than I expected," Clayton admitted. "Losing the ranch was hard, but losing my illusions about how I'd built it was harder. Strange thing is, I sleep better now than I have in years. Guilt's a heavy burden. Samuel lifted it from your shoulders before he died." Clayton nodded, looking out at the valley where a few hundred head of cattle, all that remained of his once mighty empire, grazed peacefully. "He gave me more than that. He gave me back my family's honor." "What will you do now? You're still a relatively young man, plenty of time to rebuild." "Rebuild, yes, but differently this time. I'm thinking about running for sheriff in the next election. Seems like the territory could use some honest lawmen for a change." Doc Harrison smiled. "Your father would be proud. So would Samuel. He always said the Reese family was meant to serve justice, not just pursue wealth." As the doctor rode back toward town, Clayton remained by the memorial, thinking about the choices that had shaped his life and the brother who'd given everything to set things right. The wind through the pines sounded different, now less lonely, more like a hymn of remembrance for the dead and hope for the living. In the months that followed, Clayton did indeed run for sheriff, and won by the largest margin in territorial history. His first act was to establish a fund for the families of corruption victims, financed by the remaining proceeds from his ranch liquidation. His second was to institute new policies, requiring complete transparency in all law enforcement investigations. The Reese name, which had been associated with shame and scandal for 30 years, became synonymous with integrity and justice. Clayton never remarried or had children, but he mentored dozens of young lawmen and helped establish legal precedents that protected honest settlers for generations. And every year, on the anniversary of Samuel's death, Clayton would visit the memorial and tell his brother about the progress they were making, about corrupt officials facing justice, about honest miners getting fair treatment, about a territory slowly healing from decades of institutional theft. The mountain winds would carry his words across the valley, and sometimes Clayton imagined he could hear Samuel's voice in response, no longer the fevered ramblings of a dying fugitive, but the satisfied whisper of a man whose life's work had finally been completed. Justice had been served, truth had been told, and the Reese family legacy was secure. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.